It was a quiet morning in the village of Nabiria. The air was warm, the sun gentle, and children played outside while mothers prepared the midday meal. Among them was Lila, an 8-year-old girl with a wild imagination and a love for the jungle that bordered their home. She was last seen chasing butterflies near the tree line, her laughter blending with the rustling leaves. When her mother called her in for lunch, there was no reply. At first, she thought Lila was simply lost in play. But minutes turned into hours. Worried voices began to rise. Neighbors joined the search. They combed the area, calling her name, checking every corner she might have gone. Someone found her sandal near the jungle's edge, lying on its side in the dirt. That was the only sign of her. By nightfall, panic gripped the village. Men entered the jungle with torches. Dogs sniffed along trails. But there was nothing. The jungle gave no answers. Over the next few days, search teams arrived. They brought equipment, maps, and loudspeakers. They searched deeper, wider. Still, nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no clues. Rumors spread. Some said a wild animal took her. Others feared something worse. The jungle had always been mysterious, full of stories passed down through generations. But this was real. A child had vanished. Weeks passed. The search stopped. The noise faded. Only Lila's mother kept looking, her eyes always fixed on the trees, waiting for a miracle. 5 years had passed since Lila disappeared. The village had slowly moved on, though the memory of her still lingered in quiet corners and whispered conversations. But deep in the heart of the jungle, something extraordinary was unfolding. A team of wildlife researchers, led by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, had set up their camp on the edge of the forest, intent on studying the behavior of the gorilla troop that lived in the dense foliage. For weeks, they had been monitoring the area, setting up camera traps to capture footage of the gorilla's daily life. They had no idea that their cameras would soon reveal something far more incredible than they had anticipated. It was late one evening when Dr. Mitchell reviewed the footage. At first, she watched it casually, expecting to see the usual gorillas foraging, playing, resting in the trees. But then, something unusual caught her eye. In one of the frames, she saw a figure, a human figure. She blinked and paused the video, leaning closer to the screen. There, among the gorillas, was a girl. At first, Dr. Mitchell assumed it was a mistake, maybe a trick of the light. But as the camera feed continued, the girl appeared again, walking with the gorillas, moving as one with the troop. She was barefoot, wild-haired, and covered in dirt, but it was unmistakable. Dr. Mitchell's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. But there was no mistaking it. The girl was among the gorillas, not just observing them, but living with them. The footage was clear. She was a part of their world. Excited yet bewildered, Dr. Mitchell called for a meeting with her team. They watched the footage together, their initial shock giving way to questions. Who was this girl? How had she gotten there? And more importantly, why was she living with the gorillas? The more they studied the footage, the more they realized. This wasn't just some wild animal encounter. This girl had been with the gorillas for a long time. She had adopted their behavior, moving on all fours, mimicking their gestures. She was a part of their family. As the team discussed their options, the mystery deepened. The girl they saw on the screen wasn't just lost. She was thriving in a world where no human should have survived. The team couldn't ignore what they had seen. It was an unprecedented discovery. The girl had been living with the gorillas, hidden deep within the jungle for years. The question was no longer whether they should investigate, but how to approach the situation safely. After much deliberation, they made the difficult decision to mount an expedition into the heart of the jungle, hoping to find the girl and bring her back to civilization. Dr. Mitchell and her team prepared for the journey, gathering supplies, mapping out their route, and taking every precaution. They knew the jungle was unpredictable, and the gorilla troop was notorious for being protective of their territory. Still, the team was determined to find answers. They had to understand how this girl had survived all these years, what kind of life she had been living, and, most importantly, if she could be safely reintegrated into society. The trek into the jungle was grueling. For days, they pushed deeper into the dense forest, following the faintest signs of the guerrilla troops' movements. They set up camp at strategic points, using the cameras they had placed before, hoping for more clues. The thick underbrush, the constant noise of the jungle, and the oppressive humidity made every step feel like an eternity. But the team pressed on, their focus singular. Find the girl. On the fourth day, as the sun began to set, they finally heard it. The familiar sounds of guerrillas calling to each other. The deep, rumbling calls echoed through the trees, signaling that they were near. The team moved cautiously, carefully navigating the final stretch toward the troops' location. When they reached the clearing, it was nothing short of surreal. In the middle of the group of guerrillas, there she was, Lila. She was older now, maybe 14 or 15, but it was unmistakably her. Her wild hair, her tattered clothes, and the way she moved. She was crouched low to the ground, communicating with the guerrillas in a way that seemed entirely natural to her. But what struck the team the most was how the guerrillas reacted. They didn't run away or hide. Instead, they gathered around her protectively, especially the large alpha male, who stood guard as the team approached. It was clear that this was her family now, and they were ready to defend her from any threat, human or otherwise. Dr. Mitchell knew that this moment would define everything. If they didn't act carefully, it could be dangerous for both the girl and the guerrillas. But they had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The girl was here, living with a family of guerrillas, and they had to find a way to bring her home. The team knew that approaching Lila would be delicate. The guerrillas, especially the alpha male, were on high alert, clearly protective of her. Dr. Mitchell signaled to her team to remain still, careful not to make any sudden moves that might provoke the guerrillas. The air was thick with tension as they slowly set up a perimeter around the clearing. Lila, still crouched low to the ground, noticed the movement of the humans. Her eyes locked onto Dr. Mitchell, but there was no recognition in them, only wariness. She looked at them like she was unsure whether they were friend or foe. The guerrillas, sensing her unease, tightened their circle around her, growling softly as a warning. Dr. Mitchell slowly stepped forward, speaking in the calmest voice she could muster. "Lila, it's okay. We're here to help you." For a long moment, Lila didn't respond. She only stared at them, her gaze wild, uncertain. Then, as if on cue, one of the younger guerrillas moved closer to her, brushing against her leg in a protective gesture. Lila reached down and patted its head, her expression softening for a brief second. The team knew they couldn't rush this. They had to gain Lila's trust, but they also had to ensure that the guerrillas didn't feel threatened. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Mitchell slowly extended her hand toward Lila, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Lila, we want to help you come home. We're not going to hurt you." The girl looked at her hand, then back at the guerrillas. She hesitated, glancing from one to the other, before finally, very cautiously, she stood up, her body still tense. Lila took a few steps forward, her eyes locked on Dr. Mitchell the whole time. The guerrillas didn't move, but they were watching intently, their every action focused on her. In a moment of absolute stillness, Lila reached out and touched Dr. Mitchell's hand. It was a tentative gesture, but it was enough. The bond had been made, the team quickly moved in, but with extreme care. Dr. Mitchell gently guided Lila away from the guerrillas, her hand still holding the girls. The guerrillas made no move to stop them, though the alpha male let out a low growl as they walked away. But there was no aggression, just a deep, protective concern. Once the girl was a safe distance away from the guerrillas, the team carefully tranquilized the guerrillas, ensuring no harm would come to them during their extraction. The scene felt surreal as Lila, still confused but now in their care, was led away from the jungle she had called home for so many years. The next steps would be difficult. They had to ensure Lila's safety, But more importantly, they needed to help her adjust to a world she had left behind. The girl who had been raised by gorillas was now facing the greatest challenge of all, returning to human society. Back in civilization, Lila was carefully placed in the care of medical professionals and specialists, but the journey ahead would be far from easy. The team knew that reintegrating her into human society would be a complex, delicate process. Lila had spent the last 5 years living among gorillas, and her behavior reflected that. She had to relearn everything, from language to basic social interaction. At first, she was a puzzle. Lila didn't speak. She didn't understand the sounds of human words. She moved like a gorilla, crouched low to the ground, and communicated through gestures and sounds that were foreign to her caregivers. Her body language was completely different, more animalistic, instinctive. She would often retreat into herself, rocking back and forth, a response to the overwhelming stimulation of the world around her. But the team was committed. A dedicated group of psychologists and therapists began working with her, taking slow, measured steps. They used pictures, gestures, and basic words to start connecting the dots. Lila's eyes followed them with curiosity, but there was hesitation in every movement. She was unsure, confused, and at times, frightened. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Lila began to show signs of progress. She mimicked the caregiver's actions, trying to make sense of this new world. She learned to eat with utensils, though her grip was still instinctively tight, as though she were holding onto a branch. She learned to walk upright, but it wasn't always graceful. Her body still preferred the old way, moving on all fours. The process was slow, but with each new step, Lila's world began to expand. One day during a therapy session, Lila spoke her first word. It was a simple word, but it was a breakthrough. Mama. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but the significance was undeniable. It was a moment of recognition, a moment where Lila began to reconnect with her past, with the human part of herself that had been buried deep inside. Her memory started to come back in fragments. She would have flashbacks of the jungle, the gorillas, the protective alpha male who had once been her guardian. She spoke about the gorillas in broken sentences, describing how they took care of her, how they kept her safe. Her emotions were raw and unfiltered, and though she couldn't yet express everything she had experienced, it was clear that the bond with the gorillas ran deep. As the months passed, Lila became more comfortable in her new life, but the transition was far from simple. She would often wander near the edge of the jungle, looking back toward the trees as if hoping to find a familiar face in the distance. Her caregivers would gently redirect her, but the longing in her eyes was impossible to ignore. Yet, there were moments of joy. She began to form connections with the people around her, particularly with those who worked with her daily. There was a glimmer of trust in her eyes, a slow but steady movement toward reconnecting with the human world. Lila's story was not over. The girl who had once been lost to the jungle now faced the difficult challenge of forging a new life. It would take time, patience, and love. But there was hope. Hope that one day she would find her place in a world that had once felt so foreign to her. Years passed since Lila was found living with the gorillas. She had transformed, in many ways, from the wild girl of the jungle into a young woman who had reclaimed her place in the world. Her journey of healing and rediscovery wasn't easy, but she had come a long way. She no longer crouched low to the ground. She walked upright, spoke in full sentences, and even laughed like the girl she once was. But there was something about Lila that remained untouched by the years she spent in the jungle. She still had a bond with the gorillas, one that was stronger than anything she had experienced with humans. She couldn't forget the troop that had raised her, that had protected her. It was as if that part of her heart would always belong to the jungle. Lila often returned to the outskirts of the forest, standing on the edge, gazing into the green abyss, lost in thought. Sometimes she would sit quietly on the ground, her eyes tracing the shadows of the trees, as if she could feel the presence of the gorillas still out there, She had learned to speak at public events, sharing her incredible story of survival and the lessons she had learned from her time with the gorillas. But it was clear that her heart was always torn between two worlds. While she had embraced human society and built relationships with the people who helped her, the call of the jungle, the call of her gorilla family, never fully left her. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a wildlife conservation event. The audience listened intently as she spoke about her experiences, about the protective nature of the gorillas, and the way they had cared for her when no one else could. Her words were raw and powerful, and the crowd was moved by her story. But after the event, as the crowd dispersed, Lila walked to a quiet corner of the venue, where she stood looking at a photograph of a gorilla family on display. Her fingers traced the edges of the image, a silent tribute to the family that had saved her. It was then that a young girl, no older than Lila had been when she disappeared, approached her. She shyly asked, "Do you still think about them, the gorillas?" Lila smiled softly, her eyes distant but filled with warmth. "Every day," she said. "They'll always be my family, even if we're far apart now." Lila's life would never be the same, and neither would the lives of those who heard her story. The girl who once vanished into the jungle had returned to tell a tale of survival, love, and connection, one that would change the way the world saw both humans and animals. Though she would never fully leave the jungle behind, Lila had found a new purpose in bridging the gap between the two worlds. She would spend the rest of her life advocating for wildlife conservation, sharing her story, and preserving the bond she had with her gorilla family. And as the years passed, Lila continued to visit the jungle, walking to its edge, looking for a sign, for a familiar face, for a connection that ran deeper than any words could express.